everyone, and welcome to Teaching Rails with the Real Thing. I'm Katerina Rossi, and I work at Procore, where we have one of the largest Rails monoliths in the world. And like many legacy apps, it is powerful, sprawling, and incredibly intimidating to newcomers. I've been at Procore since 2017, and I work on the directory team, which has these core data models that are depended on by pretty much every single team, and also tend to be pretty confusing, which means I've answered a lot of questions over the years, and a lot of the same question over and over again. I also happen to be a little bit obsessed with learning. I have been studying learning and cognition for fun and had been teaching non-engineers to code at Procore, just for fun as well, when I came up with the idea to combine the two together and build a course to help people stop fearing the monolith. With the help of Rebecca Scales' Instructor Academy at Procore, I built a course that teaches Rails fundamentals in context, layered with real product-specific examples instead of generic tutorials. So far, I've helped over 900 engineers across the world develop competence and confidence in our core app. Today, I'll walk you through the approach we used, how we applied learning science and teaching principles to design a technical training that's both outcome-driven and genuinely engaging, why teaching Rails alongside your real app is more motivating and builds confidence much faster than any generic tutorial ever could, and how you can reuse our framework to create your own learning course to onboard engineers into your Rails monolith, whether it's massive or not. So, as Procore has grown, we've hired more and more engineers who are new to Rails. It's hard to onboard into any large code base or also any large legacy app, but it's especially difficult if you don't know the framework, and especially difficult if that framework is Rails. Not only must you learn the complexities and a whole new framework, but it's a framework that may be very different to what people are used to. Many of our engineers come from more verbose and explicit frameworks where they expect to be able to just open up the code and see everything they need to be able to understand it right there in front of them. Rails, on the other hand, is minimal by design. If you're doing something standard, you can use very little code to get a lot done. However, if a new engineer tries to use that old just look at the code approach, there's very little there to guide them. I've heard a lot of complaints from people who are like, oh, this Rails magic, I'm so confused, I hate Rails. And what I'm actually hearing is not so much an actual true dislike of the framework, but really frustration and confusion. The solution there is not to write significantly more explicit, un-Rails-like code that defeats the purpose. Instead, we need to get them to learn Rails. So how do we do that? Why wasn't that happening already? We did clearly tell people to learn Rails. I found 3 big reasons why that wasn't really happening, why that wasn't working. First, generic tutorials are not motivating. If you're new and you're trying to get to producing code right away, you don't really want to spend hours building a toy app. It feels like busy work. And it feels disconnected from the expectations that you feel coming in. Tutorials can also be really boring, and even worse, maybe demotivating, demoralizing if you do actually try the tutorial and then you still feel lost looking at the real app. Second, even when people do invest in learning, they often use ineffective learning strategies that simply feel far more effective than they actually are. This is where the learning science starts to come in. Most people by default go to passive learning methods. For example, reading through the tutorial, watching videos, rather than active practice methods, which are far more effective. For example, retrieval practice, when you try to recall and actually use the information you're trying to learn. People can assume it's far more time efficient to just read that tutorial rather than actually trying to do it. And they get this false sense of familiarity because they're going through the tutorial and they recognize it. They're like, yes, this makes sense. I know what's going on. But just because you recognize it and that seems easy doesn't mean that you actually understand it or will be able to recall it later. This misperception that how easy it feels to learn something is correlated with how effective your learning is called the fluency effect, and happens both ways, where if something feels easy, you think you've learned it. If something feels hard, you feel like you're not learning it well. That doesn't necessarily mean that's true. Third, I found that people had insufficient time or possibly organizational support for learning. If you're expected to learn this whole new framework on top of your product, tools, and team practices, and you're expected to ship quickly, that's just all not going to happen. Something has to give, and oftentimes, framework tutorials seem low value, so that's what gets cut. These difficulties are only compounded in large, complex Rails monoliths like Procore. So Procore, we build software for the construction industry. We've been around like 20+ years and have over 800,000 commits. It's really easy to get overwhelmed or lost and confused. So my goal was to help students build a mental model of the monolith, a map to their monolith, so that even if they were not fully proficient with our app at the end of the course, they would now know where to look if they had confusion and what questions to ask. So let's talk about our approach. When I started designing this course, I didn't go, what Rails topics should I cover? Instead, and this was a huge shift in mindset for me, we asked a much more important question. What is it that we want engineers to actually be able to do at the end of the course? This was a key takeaway from Rebecca Scales Instructor Academy. This course design philosophy is called backwards design, and it helped me turn those skills that I wanted people to gain into an actionable blueprint for the course itself. If you've ever seen learning objectives before and just kind of skimmed over them and was like, I don't understand what the point of this is, I actually felt like that way too before I learned about this. But when you flip that model and build your entire course around what you want people to be able to do, it's incredibly useful. They're not so much for the learner, although they definitely can be useful for the learner when you think about it that way, as they are useful, very useful for the teacher. So, next step, when we had that list of skills that we wanted people to be able to gain, we build what's called a skills framework, where we split those into these 4 different proficiency levels. So we've got beginning, approaching, proficient, and advanced. So you want to identify what you want someone to be able to do at each level. So a beginner, you'd expect to be able to not really know much at all. Someone who's proficient is going to be able to get all of your big, normal, important tasks done, but maybe not the most crazy stuff that you'd expect, like your staff engineer to know before, after they've been there a while. So each of these skill levels, they're going to build upon the previous one, and you want to think about what sort of dependencies skills might have on other previous skills and list those previous skills as well. You can see an example of some of that on the slide here. Basically, seeing this scaffolding of skills like this is really helpful because it helps you narrow down what you want to focus on as your actual learning objectives versus what topics to cut. I specifically focused my course on getting people who are beginning to the approaching level. After converting those selected skills to learning objectives, we took each objective and then worked backwards, asking questions like, what knowledge is needed to be able to do this task well? Where are people likely to get stuck or confused? What weird edge cases or domain quirks will trip them up? And that is what became our content. Then we asked, how will they practice this skill? How will we know that they've really learned it? That became our activities and our assignments. This backwards design process is very simple but powerful. It kept everything super relevant and focused so that people were not just learning how Rails works, but how Procore works and how Rails powers it. Every concept, every exercise, every discussion, all of it tied directly to the work that they would be doing. Not only does this relevance increase motivation, but it actually helps people learn more effectively when they're immersed in the actual context in which they'll apply the skills. This is a learning theory called situated learning. We ran 2 different course formats. First, we had a 4-week-long remote version where we'd have a 2-hour weekly session that was over Zoom and a 1-hour optional office hours. The second version, we did in-person intensives that were 5 days long. We did 2 of those in Cairo and 1 in Bangalore that was actually during Diwali. Both of these used what's called a flipped classroom model. So basically, what would traditionally be like a lecture content that you would go to class and hear, that's instead provided as resources before class, and we use class for more active practice. This is really useful if you have people coming in with different skill levels. For example, you have some people who are brand new to Rails, know nothing, and other people who are experienced Rails developers, but are just new to your app. This means that those people who know Rails don't have to sit through the exact same content as beginners and can just skip the basic stuff and focus in on the stuff that's really important to your app. The class time is instead focused, like I said, on active practice, on group work, and collaborative discussions. This pushes people to actually do those exercises, do that active practice, because they know they'll be asked to show their thinking, and they'll see me like staring at them, being like, "What are you doing?" And these discussions and group work also give them real-time feedback that's calibrated to their level of knowledge. We also had assignments. These were basically homework for the remote sessions, but done during the day in the intensive sessions. These assignments were designed to carefully mimic real engineering tasks without being so overwhelming that they couldn't get started. This just enough tutorial approach really helped us narrow in on the right level of desirable difficulty. So desirable difficulty is another learning science thing where people learn best when things are a bit challenging, but not too far, not overwhelming. So the order of the content is structured to help you build that map to the monolith. It's building knowledge incrementally. First, we start at the very highest level of like how the product works, then dive down to the DB layer, and then work back up through the stack layer by layer until we reconnect to the front end and tie it all back to that product behavior. By the end of the course, learners will have a mental map of the monolith that reflects both the architecture and the domain logic. So class 1, it was called Intro to the Procore product. And the goal is to develop a core understanding of what the product is. This is what the monolith powers, what the product does. We start by highlighting the core entities that are fundamental for every team. A lot of these were my entities. For example, think users or companies. And then we describe those objects when we tell them about it, not in the front-end language, unless the front-end language matches, but the back-end language, the same terms as the models and tables that we discuss later on. If you have a simple app, you might not need a whole day for this, but Procore, like I said, very complicated. And it's very important to spend enough time on that product as a foundation, because this is what allows us in later days to be able to use the Procore monolith as our example toy app. We start with what the product is, so we can then connect what you see in the product to the code piece by piece. So let's talk about how we did this backwards design process. So one of Class 1's learning objectives was learners will explain the purpose and use of core entities, such as in their team's domain. How do we get this? So first, we had that skills framework, right? We had a skill written down. We wanted to turn that skill into something that people would be able to do, to be able to demonstrate. So we could say, yes, we know that they are able to do this because they can explain the purpose and use of core entities. For example, I think the skill for that was they have a core understanding of our core entities. How do we do that? How do we take those and make those into effective learning activities? I use something called Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is a framework for thinking about human learning as a hierarchy of cognitive skills where each level builds upon the one before. So for example, if you want to apply some knowledge, it's very difficult to do it if you don't actually understand what that knowledge is. Additionally, it's really hard to understand something if you don't remember it or don't even know it exists. So you basically need to build upon each layer. For those skills, we basically figured out, okay, where are they on this framework? And then identified what sort of skills, actions, verbs. So it might be hard to read on here, but you can kind of see under understanding, you see stuff like translating, summarizing, demonstrating, discussing. There's actually lists you can find if you Google this of what are action verbs that correlate to each of these layers. So for this objective, learners will explain the purpose and use of core entities. Explain is comprehension level, that's understanding. You can't really explain something well if you don't actually know it. You could maybe regurgitate what's been taught, what we have in, for example, this in the pre-class materials, but if you actually don't understand it, you won't really be able to explain it to others. If you can explain it to others, especially when people ask you questions back, or like I would do, ask you questions in class, then you actually are at that level of understanding. So the pre-class materials give you that first start. They give you some initial knowledge level practice. And then in class, I have them literally try that objective. I put them in groups, and I have them diagram how they understand these objects and their relationships. They can start, like I said before, by just regurgitating that content, just writing down exactly what's in the provided pre-course materials. But then they have to start moving up to comprehension, actively practicing comprehension by explaining those diagrams first to each other in the group, and then to me in the course overall as we have that interactive discussion. If you've ever heard of like Socratic methods, it's similar to that. I don't do it strictly in that format, but that sort of idea. Then the learning objective is also talked about or touched on in the assignment, where I have them distinguish if and where these entities that we've been talking about, where they appear inside of like their own domain. So that gets to that last piece of like such as their team's domain. Class 2 is where we start Rails part 1. We begin with an overall discussion of Rails philosophy and the overall structure, so they kind of get a sense of where we're going. And then we dive down to that DB layer. We talk about migrations, models, and active record. We emphasize the connection to Procore throughout. The pre-class materials actually takes those core entities that we talked about in class 1 and shows where they find those exactly in our code base. We show the exact models. We're like, here's this, and walk through that. Then in class, I have them practice doing the same thing with those entities that they talked about for their team or any other if they don't know which sort of team that they're going to be working on. I have them, again, work in groups, work on comprehension by answering questions like, what are some models for your domain? What DB tables do they map to? What are some associations? What are some scopes? This helps start taking them up from that knowledge level into comprehension. The assignment for this class is actually one of my favorites. It's called Micro Procore, and this is your tutorial to build a new Rails app. But instead of just being a generic tutorial, it's literally mirroring the exact code that we have in use today. The migrations, the models, the associations, all of that they write are for those core entities that we've just been spending 2 days talking about, or 2 weeks if you're in the remote session. It even includes some of the weird quirks. This helps deepen their understanding of Rails, but not just that, it also sharpens their instinct for our specific code base, and hopefully should provide some empathy for our original devs 20+ years ago, as they're pretty closely following in their footsteps. In class 3, we continue our path up through the stack. We talk about routes, controllers, JSON serialization, and Procore-specific complexities. This class is really focused on the remaining fundamentals for understanding and being able to build a REST API, because that's super important for our Rails devs and forms, I'd say, probably the majority of the sort of work we do. In our case, this means layering in a lot of Procore-specific complexities, because we do have a pretty complicated permissions framework, various other things that you will see in that controller layer. And that means postponing the front end into the next class. Your needs may differ. The assignment here builds off of Micro Procore. Basically, I have a hacked version where I've added on to the base of basically what I would have them do in their tutorial, and it provides them with an endpoint to practice editing, as well as space to make a new API that is going to match the exact same format they would do if they're doing it in the real app. And then, at the end, after they've done that, I tell them, oh, by the way, this actually does exist in our real monolith. So they're able to pull them up side by side and compare what the code that they've just written looks like and the code that's in our app. This really helps them start to bridge that gap between their toy app and the real thing. Class 4 is called Bringing It All Together, and we finally complete our journey through the stack. We start with that focus on the front end, tying together everything that we've seen in the code with the product behavior from class 1. And then we also cover a bunch of miscellaneous sort of things, testing best practices, API documentation, basically just finishing our swing on everything a dev needs to know to be able to complete common tasks. At this point, even if they aren't fully proficient, their mental map should be starting to come into focus. So I have them use it. One of the activities in this class is called Code Finders. Basically what I have them do is open up, or well, really I open up the Procore app, and I'm like, guys, just tell me where to click. Just get me lost. We just click random places until we end up in some unknown place, and then I have them work together using everything they've learned so far to figure out where that corresponding code that matches the front-end piece is. This really ties everything together and makes them practice using that mental map. This is also really important for Procore because finding the associated code for something is a really big challenge and a really big pain point for people coming in. In class 5, this actually only exists in the intensive session, but we don't really have any set content. Instead, this is a buffer day for flexibility, which allows earlier sessions to go over if people need extra time for discussions, if we have a really good discussion or really good question come up that I've brought people together to be like, oh yes, this will be useful for everybody, let's come discuss this. It also gives people a chance to revisit topics, areas of uncertainty, or dig deeper into the parts of the monolith that are most relevant to them. And I give people the chance to request topics. So earlier in the class, if they're like, oh, can you explain this random thing? I'll be like, OK, after we've covered these things, let's talk about that in day 5. So let's talk about outcomes and learnings. So far, we've had over 1,200 enrollments over multiple cohorts and formats, including the fully remote, in-person intensive, and a new async format. And when students participate, it really works. I've received feedback like this. I've been recommending your Intro to Cornerstone course to every newcomer. Almost all of them feel more comfortable with the monolith after taking it. Thank you so much, Kat. We also have other indicators of success. One, it's not just useful for people that are new to Rails. I've gotten positive feedback from people who are Rails devs and came in already knowing that, just wanting to dig into the Procore-specific stuff. I've also had repeat students who've taken the course multiple times in person to be able to dig deeper into nuances now that they more deeply understood the basics. This flipped classroom model and the interaction-based teaching method where everything's active, that's what even made this possible, because I am able to specifically focus my questions and our learning activities on wherever their level of experience is. I also field fewer repeat questions, and more importantly, past students are now confidently answering those same questions that I had to answer before, especially the ones that were over and over again. And these past students are also contributing to documentation and leading a whole series of their own learning sessions. Shout out to Talk-Driven Development and Paul right here in the front. So moving on, key learnings, what worked? The in-person format was a standout winner. This overall had a lot more interactive of a feel because people were in person and could literally see each other. They could see that I'm like, yes, it is totally OK to make mistakes. This is a place where we are playing with learning. We are not trying to execute. People asked more questions, they collaborated more with each other, and just overall opened up in ways that just didn't happen over Zoom. Time was also clearly set aside for the course. They knew that, especially in the intensive, they were coming in, and they had this block of time that they were going to be working on this. So if they were going to work on something else and not actually do it, they had to kind of sneak. So this meant that people were far more motivated and able to really take advantage of that learning time. These interactions in person also helped create that sense of psychological safety that's really essential to get into learning mode, where they could make mistakes and ask stupid questions without concern. Another key learning was moving the assignment that was normally homework to the middle of the day. So in the very first intensive session, I had that at the end of the day, and people basically, 5 p.m. would disappear and skip the most important part where they were really getting that deepest level of application. So the activities tended to be kind of more in that middle level, and then we really got up to application by activities. So it'd be basically if you had an apply level skill, going back to the framework, it would be knowledge level in the pre-course materials, moving up to understanding in the exercises, and then up to application through the exercises into the assignments. So these assignments were very important, and putting it in the middle of the day meant that people were there, they worked together, they asked questions, and then they actually did apply what they had just learned. I also got to witness one student suddenly get Rails magic, which was really awesome. I don't remember exactly the whole conversation, but it was looking at something like either a association or a migration or something, and they were just like, wait, that's all I have to write? And I was like, yeah, that's all you have to write. How cool! And this was super validating for me because this was the exact same sort of code that I was getting complaints about previously. Another takeaway was that targeting real pain points really paid off. These were the most effective sessions where we were diving into what engineers found annoying, confusing, or just plain weird. Some of the most interactive sessions came out of these with deeper questions and knowledge sharing, and they seeded future talks. Lastly, we learned that the course contents and readings need to be accessible after the course. This is not even just by students. So having those only available in the course meant that they weren't usable as this useful reference for both the students, but also it wasn't discoverable for devs who might not even know the course existed yet, or sendable. For example, when someone had a question, be like, I'm confused by this data model. We had a whole write-up in the course. Once we moved that to an internal handbook where everything else was, we could then send those links along and just overall make it more discoverable and usable. So moving on to challenges. One of the biggest challenges was ensuring enough uninterrupted time. Even the intensive, which was clearly scheduled as a full week, people didn't realize they actually needed that full week for class. And when they had other expectations, the split attention meant that they couldn't fully engage. So if you're building something similar, make sure you advocate hard for protected time. Second was that interactivity in the remote sessions, the participation was really hit or miss. So the breakout rooms in Zoom, that was really effective. Often had people doing activities with FigJam. But the office hours, on the other hand, were super quiet, and many people defaulted back to those passive methods and didn't end up submitting the assignments. We also have an async version now with video recordings and guided modules, but I'll be honest, it is way too easy to skip the hard and active parts there where the learning actually happens, and I would really like to build a much more interactive version in the future because I do think there's a lot that we could do with an async version. Finally, scaling the course has been tricky. I've had a few amazing engineers help me teach this, but the course is deep, requires strong domain knowledge and adaptability, plus time to prep, and actually time to teach. So all of this is a tough lift alongside other priorities. I'm still figuring out how to build a more sustainable teaching model. If you're building your own, I recommend getting multiple instructors from the start and giving them dedicated time to focus both on building out that course and then teaching the course. So let's close out with how you can build off our structure. First, start with outcomes. Define what it is that you want engineers to be able to do by the end of the course. Identify what different proficiency levels look like for the rest of your skills, and continue the backwards design process I outlined before, where you take that skill, identify where it is on the Bloom's taxonomy, use that to make a verb, make it active, and then make those into your content, activities, etc. Next, teach what your app does, and then how it does it. Start with product concepts, what the system powers and key objects relate, so that people understand the gist of how that works. Then teach Rails from the bottom up, using your app as the product example. The relevance of staying grounded in your real app both boosts confidence and motivation and effectiveness. Next, have students be active learners. Active practice is the backbone of this course. Use that backwards design process to walk through your learning objectives, map it to Bloom's level, and make those activities and assignments where students practice those skills. For all of this, you really need to rely on domain experts. They're the ones who know what day-to-day work in your app actually looks like, what concepts are going to be the most important to learn, what is going to be the most confusing, and also, if you're unable to fit everything in that you want to teach them, you want them to be able to do, they're the ones who can prioritize what is the most hard to learn in your context based on that domain expertise. Additionally, if you want to be able to have multiple levels of people coming in, it's those instructors who deeply understand the quirks, history, and architecture who will be able to support that range of skill levels and answer those unexpected questions that dig into some strange detail that someone new might never have even heard of. Lastly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, give people time to learn, not just cram between meetings, and safety to ask questions, make mistakes, and explore. If you create those conditions, this course will do more than just teach your monolith. It will build long-lasting confidence, collaboration, and community. Alrighty, thank you.